The morning sun cast long shadows across the reinforced walls of Haven Ridge, the last known sanctuary for humanity in what was once the state of Colorado. Marcus Thompson adjusted his rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes, his weathered hands betraying the nervousness he refused to show his fellow guards. Below in the courtyard, children played with makeshift toys while their parents tended to vegetable gardens that had become more precious than gold. It had been 18 months since the outbreak began, and Haven Ridge had stood as an impenetrable fortress against the endless hordes of the infected. The community of 800 survivors had grown comfortable behind their 30-foot concrete barriers, topped with razor wire and electrified fencing that hummed constantly with deadly current. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the settlement's chief medical officer, emerged from the medical bay with her usual purposeful stride, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had become her trademark. She carried a clipboard filled with vaccination schedules and health reports, maintaining the illusion of normalcy that kept morale high among the survivors. The sound of her boots on the metal walkway drew Marcus's attention, and he offered her a reassuring nod that neither of them truly felt. Something had been different about the infected lately. They moved with more coordination, showed signs of primitive problem-solving, and worst of all, they had begun to gather in unprecedented numbers just beyond the horizon. Captain Jake Morrison, a former Marine who had taken command of Haven Ridge's defenses, stood in the communications tower reviewing reports from their scout teams. The radio crackled with static as Patrol Team Alpha checked in from the eastern perimeter, their voices tense but professional. "All clear on the eastern approach, Captain. No movement detected in the past 4 hours." But Morrison knew that silence from the infected was often more terrifying than their usual moaning and scratching at the walls. His instincts, honed by 2 tours overseas and countless battles against the undead, told him that something catastrophic was building just beyond their sight. In the settlement's workshop, mechanical engineer David Chen worked frantically on reinforcing the main gate's hydraulic systems, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The gate had been showing signs of stress from repeated impacts, and he knew that their survival depended on every bolt, wire, and weld holding firm against whatever was coming. His assistant, Rebecca Martinez, handed him tools with practiced efficiency while keeping one eye on the security monitors that displayed feeds from cameras positioned around the perimeter. The screens showed empty fields and abandoned farmhouses, but both engineers had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded an attack: the way birds suddenly stopped singing, how even the wind seemed to hold its breath before the storm arrived. Meanwhile, in the settlement's command center, communications specialist Tommy Rodriguez monitored radio frequencies, desperately searching for signs of other survivor communities. For weeks, the airwaves had been eerily quiet, with their regular check-ins from settlements in Utah and Wyoming falling silent one by one. His equipment picked up only static and the occasional automated emergency broadcast that had been repeating the same message for months. The isolation was becoming suffocating, and Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that Haven Ridge might truly be the last bastion of human civilization. As the morning progressed, a low rumble began to emanate from the northern hills, so subtle at first that most residents dismissed it as distant thunder. But Marcus Thompson, still maintaining his vigilant watch from the wall, recognized the sound immediately. It was the collective moan of thousands of infected voices, growing stronger with each passing minute. He reached for his radio with trembling fingers, knowing that the call he was about to make would shatter the peaceful morning and thrust Haven Ridge into its greatest battle yet. The rumble grew louder, and through his binoculars, Marcus could see the first dark shapes cresting the hills like a black tide rolling toward their sanctuary. Dr. Warren looked up from her clipboard as the emergency sirens began to wail, their piercing sound cutting through the morning air and sending children running to their parents' arms. Captain Morrison's voice boomed over the settlement's public address system, calm but urgent. "All civilians to designated safe zones immediately. Defense teams to positions. This is not a drill." The 18 months of relative peace were about to end, and everyone in Haven Ridge knew that their survival would depend on how well they had prepared for this moment. The infected were coming, and this time they brought numbers that could overwhelm even the strongest defenses. The northern horizon disappeared beneath a writhing mass of decaying flesh as thousands of infected poured over the hills like a grotesque avalanche. Captain Morrison gripped his binoculars so tightly his knuckles turned white, watching in horrified fascination as the horde moved with an unsettling coordination he had never witnessed before. These weren't the scattered, mindless wanderers they had grown accustomed to fighting. This was an organized assault that defied everything they thought they knew about the infected. The creatures moved in loose formations, with faster specimens flanking the main group while others carried crude weapons scavenged from abandoned towns. Dr. Warren rushed to the command center, her medical training temporarily forgotten as she stared at the tactical displays showing red dots multiplying across their screens. "How many are we looking at?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Tommy Rodriguez's voice cracked as he responded, "Conservative estimate puts them at 15,000, but they're still coming over the ridge." The number hung in the air like a death sentence, considering Haven Ridge's entire population was barely 800 souls, with only 200 capable of combat. Marcus Thompson's rifle barked its first shot of the battle, the sound echoing across the settlement as he picked off the fastest infected that had broken away from the main group. His bullet found its mark, dropping a creature that had once been a woman in a tattered business suit, but 10 more immediately took her place. The infected seemed drawn by some invisible force toward Haven Ridge, their collective moaning creating a sound like rushing wind that made the settlement's children cry and adults reach instinctively for weapons. Rebecca Martinez worked frantically in the workshop, her hands flying over control panels as she activated every defensive system David had installed over the past months. Automated turrets rose from concealed positions along the walls, their targeting systems locking onto the approaching threat while electrified barriers hummed to life with deadly voltage. But even as the defenses came online, she could see that they were facing numbers that would overwhelm any static defense through sheer attrition. The infected reached the outer perimeter fence at exactly 11:47 in the morning, and the first wave died in spectacular fashion as high-voltage electricity coursed through their bodies. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, but the creatures behind them simply climbed over the charred corpses of their predecessors, using the dead as insulation against the electrical barriers. Captain Morrison realized with growing dread that the infected had somehow learned to adapt, to sacrifice their own kind to achieve their objectives. David worked desperately to reroute power to the main gate as hundreds of infected began throwing themselves against the reinforced steel, their combined weight creating stress fractures in the hydraulic supports he had just finished repairing. The gate shuddered with each impact, and warning lights flashed red across his control panel as systems began to fail under the relentless assault. Through the workshop's reinforced windows, he could see infected climbing on top of each other, forming grotesque human pyramids in attempts to scale the 30-foot walls. Tommy's radio equipment picked up something that made his blood run cold: organized communication between groups of infected, consisting of guttural sounds that seemed to convey tactical information. "Captain, they're coordinating their attack patterns," he reported, his voice barely audible over the chaos outside. "The eastern group is holding back while the northern force tests our defenses." This revelation shattered their understanding of the infected as mindless predators and transformed them into something far more terrifying: an enemy capable of strategy and learning. Dr. Warren moved through the medical bay, preparing for casualties while trying to process the implications of what they were witnessing. If the infected could coordinate attacks, learn from their failures and adapt their tactics, then every assumption about surviving the outbreak needed to be reconsidered. She checked her supplies of antibiotics and surgical equipment, knowing that the coming battle would test not just their defenses but their ability to treat the wounded under impossible circumstances. The first breach came at the eastern wall, where a group of infected had used abandoned vehicles as battering rams, driving them repeatedly against a weak point in the concrete until it cracked. Marcus redirected his fire toward the breach, but for every infected he dropped, 3 more squeezed through the gap. The sound of gunfire intensified as other defenders joined the desperate attempt to seal the opening, but ammunition was limited and the infected seemed infinite. Captain Morrison made the hardest decision of his military career, ordering the evacuation of the outer defensive positions and falling back to the inner compound. "All units, execute fallback protocol 7, he commanded over the radio, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The defenders began their fighting retreat, covering each other as they abandoned the outer walls to the advancing horde, knowing that each step backward brought the infected closer to the civilians they had sworn to protect. The retreat to the inner compound became a nightmare of coordinated chaos as Captain Morrison's defenders fought a running battle through Haven Ridge's carefully planned defensive zones. The infected poured through multiple breaches now, their numbers seeming to multiply with each passing minute as more creatures emerged from the surrounding wilderness. Marcus Thompson found himself separated from his unit during the fallback, trapped on an elevated walkway as infected climbed the support structures below him like deadly spiders ascending their web. His ammunition was running dangerously low, each shot now precious beyond measure, and he could hear the metal groaning under the weight of dozens of creatures scaling the framework. Dr. Warren had transformed the medical bay into a fortress within a fortress, barricading the entrances while maintaining a clear view of the courtyard through reinforced windows. The children huddled in the basement levels with their parents, their frightened whispers barely audible over the sounds of battle raging above. She clutched a pistol in her trembling hands, having never imagined that her oath to do no harm would be tested in such a horrific manner. Through the windows, she watched infected overrun the vegetable gardens that had represented hope and normalcy, trampling months of careful cultivation under their rotting feet. The creatures moved with disturbing purpose, some heading directly for the main buildings while others seemed to be searching for specific targets, as if following predetermined assignments in their grotesque assault plan. David and Rebecca worked frantically in the workshop, now sealed behind emergency blast doors, as they attempted to activate the settlement's final defensive measure, a series of explosive charges planted throughout the outer compound. The detonation would collapse several buildings and create debris barriers, but it would also destroy months of irreplaceable work and potentially trap any survivors still fighting in those areas. David's finger hovered over the activation switch as Rebecca monitored the security feeds, watching their friends and neighbors fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. "We have to give them more time," she whispered, though both engineers knew that time was a luxury they could no longer afford. Tommy Rodriguez had lost contact with half the defensive teams, his radio equipment picking up only static and the occasional desperate call for assistance from isolated pockets of survivors. The communications tower swayed ominously as infected began climbing its support cables, their combined weight threatening to bring down the entire structure. He gathered the most critical equipment into a portable case, preparing for another evacuation while trying to maintain contact with the outside world. His last transmission to any potential survivors beyond Haven Ridge was simple and heartbreaking. "This is Haven Ridge calling any stations. We are under massive assault. If anyone receives this message, stay away from Colorado. The infected have evolved." Captain Morrison established a new command post in the Central Administration Building, its reinforced construction offering better protection than the outer defensive positions. From his elevated position, he could see the true scope of the disaster unfolding around them. The infected had not only breached their perimeter but had done so with tactical precision that suggested intelligence far beyond anything they had previously encountered. Groups of creatures moved in coordinated patterns, some creating diversions while others flanked defensive positions, and most terrifying of all, they seemed to be learning from each engagement. The captain's military training told him that they were facing an enemy that could adapt faster than human defenders could respond, making traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Marcus finally reached the inner compound after a harrowing journey across rooftops and through maintenance tunnels, his uniform torn and bloodied from close encounters with infected that had nearly cost him his life. He burst into the command post with urgent intelligence that chilled everyone present. "Captain, they're not just attacking randomly. I saw them setting up what looked like staging areas, organizing into different groups with specific objectives. Some were heading for the power station, others toward the water treatment facility." This revelation confirmed Morrison's worst fears. The infected weren't just trying to kill the survivors, they were attempting to systematically destroy the infrastructure that made Haven Ridge habitable. Dr. Warren's voice crackled over the radio from the medical bay. "We're seeing infected behavior that defies everything we know about the virus. Some of them are using tools, others are problem-solving in real time. Whatever caused this evolution, it's changed the fundamental nature of the threat we're facing." The sound of explosions echoed through the compound as David finally activated the outer defensive charges, bringing down several buildings and controlled collapses that created temporary barriers against the advancing horde. But even as debris rained down and dust clouds obscured the battlefield, everyone in Haven Ridge knew that they had only bought themselves precious minutes, not salvation. The infected were already finding ways around the obstacles, climbing over rubble with the same relentless determination that had brought them this far. Captain Morrison gathered his remaining officers for what might be their final tactical meeting, knowing that conventional warfare had failed against an enemy that could think, adapt, and coordinate their attacks with terrifying efficiency. In the suffocating darkness of the administration building's basement, Dr. Warren made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about the outbreak. While treating wounded defenders, she noticed something extraordinary in the blood samples of those who had been bitten but not yet turned, microscopic organisms that seemed to be fighting against the infection with unprecedented success. Her hands shook as she adjusted the portable microscope's focus, unable to believe what she was seeing through the lens. The virus that had decimated humanity was being systematically attacked by what appeared to be an evolved strain of beneficial bacteria, something that shouldn't exist in nature but was clearly present in the bloodstream of Haven Ridge's survivors. Captain Morrison received her urgent summons just as another wave of infected began their assault on the inner compound's defenses, their coordination now so sophisticated that they were using debris from the collapsed buildings as shields and battering rams. He found Dr. Warren hunched over her equipment in the medical bay's makeshift laboratory, her face illuminated by the glow of computer screens displaying genetic sequences that defied conventional understanding. "Captain, you need to see this immediately," she said without looking up from her work. "The people of Haven Ridge aren't just survivors. We're carriers of something that could end this nightmare permanently." Her explanation came in rapid, excited bursts as she showed him microscopic footage of the bacterial warfare taking place in human blood cells, a battle between infection and cure that was happening on a molecular level. Marcus Thompson and his remaining squad members had taken positions in the compound's clock tower, using its height advantage to coordinate sniper fire against infected leaders who seemed to be directing the assault. Through his scope, he observed behavior that chilled him to the bone, infected creatures that appeared to be communicating through complex gestures, pointing toward specific targets and organizing flanking maneuvers with military precision. One creature, wearing the tattered remains of what had once been a scientist's lab coat, stood apart from the others, its movements deliberate and calculating as it studied the compound's defenses. When Marcus's bullet found its target, the creature's death seemed to cause momentary confusion among the other infected, confirming his suspicion that they had developed a command structure. Tommy Rodriguez worked desperately to boost his radio's transmission power, knowing that Dr. Warren's discovery needed to reach any surviving scientific communities that might still exist. His equipment had detected faint signals from what could be research facilities in the eastern states, but the infected assault was interfering with his ability to establish clear communication. As he fine-tuned the frequencies, he began picking up something that made his blood run cold, radio chatter that sounded almost human but was coming from the infected forces surrounding Haven Ridge. The creatures were not only coordinating their attacks but were doing so through primitive radio communication, using equipment they had somehow learned to operate. David and Rebecca emerged from the workshop with a desperate plan that could either save Haven Ridge or destroy it completely. They had discovered that the settlement's geothermal power system could be overloaded to create a massive electromagnetic pulse, potentially disrupting whatever was allowing the infected to coordinate their attacks. The risk was enormous. The EMP would destroy all their electronic equipment and leave them defenseless against future attacks, but it might also break the mysterious connection that was making the infected so dangerously organized. Rebecca's analysis of the infected's behavior patterns suggested that they were being controlled or influenced by some form of electromagnetic signal, possibly emanating from a source beyond the immediate area. Dr. Warren's research took a darker turn as she realized that the beneficial bacteria in their blood wasn't naturally occurring, it was artificial, created in a laboratory and somehow introduced into Haven Ridge's water supply months before the current attack. Someone had been conducting experiments on the settlement's population without their knowledge, using them as test subjects in what appeared to be an attempt to develop immunity to the infection. The implications were staggering. Haven Ridge hadn't survived by luck or superior defenses, but because they had been deliberately protected by an unknown benefactor who was using them as living laboratories. Captain Morrison felt the weight of command crushing down on him as he processed this information, realizing that their entire existence had been manipulated by forces beyond their understanding. The infected assault intensified as if responding to their growing awareness, with creatures now attempting to breach the medical bay specifically, as though they somehow knew about Dr. Warren's discovery. The captain made a command decision that would determine the fate of everyone in Haven Ridge. They would implement David's EMP plan while simultaneously attempting to evacuate the most critical personnel and research data to a secondary location. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the compound as infected finally breached the outer windows of the administration building, their grotesque faces appearing in doorways as they began their final push toward the heart of Haven Ridge. Dr. Warren gathered her research data while preparing syringes filled with the bacterial solution, knowing that if they could escape with both the cure and the knowledge of how to produce it, humanity might still have a chance. The battle for Haven Ridge was no longer just about survival. It had become a race to preserve the key to ending the outbreak before the infected could destroy the only hope for humanity's future. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from Haven Ridge's geothermal facility like an invisible shockwave, instantly plunging the settlement into complete darkness as every electronic device within a 5-mile radius died simultaneously. The effect on the infected was immediate and dramatic. Their coordinated movements dissolved into chaotic wandering as whatever signal had been controlling them was severed, leaving thousands of creatures stumbling aimlessly through the compound like lost children. Captain Morrison felt a mixture of relief and terror as he watched the organized assault crumble, knowing that while they had broken the infected's coordination, they had also destroyed their own ability to communicate and coordinate their escape. Dr. Warren clutched her research samples and hastily written notes as she made her way through the darkened corridors of the medical bay, guided only by emergency chemical lights that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The bacterial solution that could potentially cure the infection was stored in a specially designed cooling case that would preserve its viability for 72 hours without refrigeration, but getting it to a functioning laboratory would require a journey through infected territory that seemed impossible under current circumstances. She could hear the confused moaning of infected creatures throughout the building, their previous tactical intelligence replaced by the familiar mindless hunger that had characterized the early days of the outbreak. Marcus Thompson and his sniper team found themselves trapped in the clock tower as infected filled the stairwells below, their escape route cut off by creatures that were no longer following coordinated attack patterns but were simply following the scent of living humans. The tower's windows offered a panoramic view of the chaos engulfing Haven Ridge, with infected wandering in circles through the compound while others stood motionless as if waiting for instructions that would never come. Marcus realized that the EMP had created both an opportunity and a crisis. While the infected were no longer organized, their sheer numbers still made escape nearly impossible, and without radio communication, coordinating with other survivors had become a deadly game of chance. Tommy Rodriguez worked frantically to restore basic communication using equipment that had been shielded from the electromagnetic pulse, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he bypassed damaged circuits and rerouted power from backup batteries. His efforts were rewarded when he managed to establish short-range communication with the other survivor groups scattered throughout the compound, but the news he received was grim. Several defensive positions had been overrun during the confusion following the EMP, and at least 30 survivors were missing and presumed dead. The infected might have lost their coordination, but they had gained something equally dangerous in their current state: unpredictability that made planning an escape route nearly impossible. David and Rebecca had anticipated the power loss and prepared a series of mechanical escape routes that didn't rely on electronic systems, including a network of maintenance tunnels that connected the major buildings and led to concealed exits beyond the compound's perimeter. They moved through these passages like ghosts, carrying essential supplies and equipment while avoiding the infected that had found their way into the tunnel system. Rebecca's knowledge of the compound's layout proved invaluable as they navigated by touch and memory through passages that had become a maze of debris and abandoned equipment. The sound of infected scratching at tunnel walls followed them through the darkness, a constant reminder that discovery would mean certain death. Captain Morrison established a rally point in the compound's underground garage, where a small fleet of armored vehicles had been maintained for exactly this type of emergency evacuation. The vehicles had been hardened against electromagnetic interference, their engines and basic systems still functional despite the pulse that had destroyed more sophisticated electronics. As survivors began arriving at the rally point through various escape routes, Morrison realized that fewer than 200 of Haven Ridge's 800 residents had made it to the evacuation zone, a devastating loss that weighed heavily on his conscience as their leader. Dr. Warren arrived at the garage carrying her precious research materials, her face grim as she reported that the medical bay had been completely overrun and that several other survivors had sacrificed themselves to ensure her escape with the potential cure. The bacterial solution represented humanity's best hope for ending the outbreak, but it would be worthless without access to a functioning laboratory capable of mass production, and such facilities were rare in a world where most scientific infrastructure had been destroyed or abandoned. Morrison made the difficult decision to split their group into 3 separate convoys, reasoning that multiple smaller groups would have a better chance of reaching safety than one large target that would attract every infected creature for miles around. The first convoy would head east toward rumored government facilities in Kansas. The second would attempt to reach the CDC's backup laboratory in Utah, and the third would travel north to investigate reports of a functioning research station in Montana. Dr. Warren would accompany the Utah convoy, carrying the original bacterial samples and research data, while copies of her notes would travel with each group to ensure that the information would survive even if she didn't. As the garage doors opened manually and the first convoy prepared to depart into the infected wasteland beyond Haven Ridge, everyone understood that they were leaving behind not just their home but their last illusion of safety in a world that had become fundamentally hostile to human survival. The infected that had once threatened them with organized intelligence now posed a different but equally deadly threat. Thousands of unpredictable predators scattered across the landscape, driven by hunger and instinct rather than strategy, making every mile of their journey a gamble with death itself. The three convoys departed Haven Ridge under cover of darkness, their headlights cutting through the night like beacons that attracted every infected creature within miles to their position. Dr. Warren's convoy, consisting of 2 armored vehicles and 12 survivors, faced immediate challenges as they navigated through the scattered remains of the infected horde that had attacked their settlement. The creatures, still disoriented from the electromagnetic pulse, wandered aimlessly across the highway, forcing the drivers to weave between rotting bodies while maintaining enough speed to avoid being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers surrounding them. Captain Morrison, leading the eastern convoy toward Kansas, discovered that the infected's loss of coordination had created an even more dangerous situation than their previous organized assault. Without central control, the creatures had spread across the entire region like a plague of locusts, making it impossible to predict where the next threat would emerge. His convoy of 15 survivors in 3 vehicles encountered their first major obstacle at a collapsed overpass where hundreds of infected had gathered, drawn by some unknown instinct to congregate in areas where human scent lingered. The captain made the difficult decision to abandon the main highway and take back roads through mountainous terrain, knowing that while this route would be slower and more treacherous, it offered their best chance of avoiding the massive concentrations of infected that blocked the major transportation corridors. Marcus Thompson found himself assigned to the northern convoy heading toward Montana, his sniper skills deemed essential for clearing obstacles and providing overwatch during fuel stops and equipment repairs. Their journey began with a harrowing escape through the outskirts of Haven Ridge, where infected emerged from every building in shadow, their movements erratic and unpredictable as they responded to the sound of engines and the scent of living humans. The convoy's lead vehicle, driven by Rebecca Martinez, used its reinforced bumper to clear a path through clusters of infected while Marcus provided precision fire from the roof hatch, each shot carefully aimed to conserve their limited ammunition supply. The landscape they traveled through bore little resemblance to the Colorado they remembered from before the outbreak, with abandoned towns and cities serving as monuments to humanity's rapid fall from civilization. Tommy Rodriguez, traveling with Dr. Warren's convoy, managed to establish brief radio contact with each of the other groups during their first night on the road, confirming that all 3 convoys had successfully escaped Haven Ridge but were facing significant challenges in their respective journeys. His portable communication equipment, shielded from the EMP's effects, picked up disturbing transmissions from unknown sources, garbled messages that seemed to originate from infected creatures that had somehow retained the ability to operate radio equipment despite their apparent loss of higher intelligence. These transmissions suggested that while the electromagnetic pulse had disrupted the infected's coordination, it hadn't completely severed whatever connection had allowed them to communicate, and pockets of organized infected might still exist in areas beyond the pulse's range. Dr. Warren's convoy encountered their first major crisis at a fuel depot outside the town of Riverside, where they discovered that the facility had become a feeding ground for infected that had learned to associate the location with human activity. The creatures had set what could only be described as a trap, using abandoned vehicles to create a funnel that would force any survivors seeking fuel into a kill zone surrounded by dozens of infected hiding in the facility's buildings. David, who had joined Warren's convoy as their mechanical specialist, recognized the tactical nature of the ambush and realized that some infected retained enough intelligence to plan complex operations even after the EMP had disrupted their mass coordination. The convoy was forced to fight their way through the ambush, using precious ammunition and medical supplies to treat injuries sustained during the battle, while the sound of gunfire attracted additional infected from the surrounding area. Captain Morrison's eastern convoy faced a different but equally deadly challenge when they encountered a group of human survivors who had turned to banditry, preying on other survivor groups for supplies and equipment. These raiders had established a roadblock at a strategic choke point between 2 mountain ranges, demanding tribute from any convoy seeking passage while threatening to alert nearby infected hordes to the location of those who refused to pay. Morrison's military training told him that negotiating with such groups was futile. They would take whatever they wanted and likely kill the convoy members anyway to prevent them from warning other survivors about the roadblock. The ensuing firefight between the convoy and the raiders attracted infected from both sides of the mountains, creating a three-way battle that tested every survivor's ability to distinguish between human enemies and infected threats in the chaos of combat. Marcus Thompson's northern convoy discovered that the infected's behavior varied significantly based on geographic location and local conditions, with creatures in urban areas showing different patterns than those in rural regions. In the abandoned city of Boulder, they encountered infected that had somehow learned to use the urban environment to their advantage, setting up ambush points in buildings and using the city's layout to herd potential prey into areas where escape would be impossible. The convoy was forced to abandon their vehicles and proceed on foot through sections of the city, carrying only essential supplies while navigating through buildings filled with infected that seemed to anticipate their movements. Rebecca's driving skills proved invaluable as she led the group through maintenance tunnels and subway systems that the infected had not yet learned to navigate effectively, but the constant threat of discovery made every step a test of nerves and endurance that pushed the survivors to their physical and psychological limits. 3 weeks after the fall of Haven Ridge, Dr. Warren's convoy finally reached the CDC's backup facility in Utah, only to discover that the laboratory had been abandoned for months, its equipment stripped by previous survivor groups and its security systems long since failed. The building stood as a hollow monument to scientific ambition, its empty corridors echoing with the footsteps of Warren's exhausted team as they searched desperately for any functional equipment that could help them reproduce the bacterial cure. Rebecca Martinez, whose mechanical expertise had kept their vehicles running through countless breakdowns and attacks, found a partially intact laboratory in the facility's basement levels, hidden behind blast doors that had protected it from both infected intrusion and human scavenging. Working with salvaged equipment and improvised solutions, Dr. Warren began the painstaking process of culturing the bacterial samples she had carried from Haven Ridge, knowing that their limited supplies would allow for only one attempt at mass production. The bacterial solution that had protected Haven Ridge's survivors proved even more remarkable under laboratory analysis, showing an ability to not only prevent infection but to reverse the early stages of the viral transformation in recently infected individuals. Warren's hands trembled as she prepared the first batch of what could become humanity's salvation, understanding that the weight of an entire species' survival rested on her ability to successfully replicate the microscopic warriors that had been secretly protecting her community. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison's Eastern convoy had reached the government facility in Kansas, only to find it occupied by a well-organized military unit that had been conducting their own research into the outbreak's origins. The facility's commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, revealed that Haven Ridge had been one of several test sites where experimental treatments had been introduced into isolated populations, part of a desperate government program to develop immunity before the infected could evolve beyond human ability to contain them. Morrison learned that the electromagnetic signals controlling the infected had originated from a massive transmission array in Nevada, built by the same scientists who had created the bacterial cure, and that destroying the array had been the government's primary objective before communication with their strike teams was lost. The revelation that Haven Ridge's survival had been orchestrated as part of a larger experiment filled Morrison with a mixture of rage and hope, rage at being used as unwitting test subjects, but hope that other communities might have been similarly protected and could serve as sources for the cure. Marcus Thompson's northern convoy discovered something extraordinary in the mountains of Montana, a thriving community of nearly 3,000 survivors who had not only survived the outbreak but had begun to rebuild civilization on a scale that seemed impossible in the post-apocalyptic world. The settlement, called New Eden, had been established by a group of scientists and military personnel who had received advance warning of the outbreak and had prepared accordingly, creating a self-sufficient community with advanced defenses and sustainable agriculture. The leaders of New Eden revealed that they had been monitoring radio transmissions from across the continent and had been tracking the progress of various survivor groups, including the convoys from Haven Ridge. Their scientists had been working on their own version of a cure, but Dr. Warren's bacterial samples represented a breakthrough that could accelerate their research by months or even years. Tommy Rodriguez's communication equipment proved invaluable in establishing contact between the three separated convoy groups, creating a network of information sharing that allowed each group to benefit from the discoveries and resources of the others. His radio transmissions carried news of Dr. Warren's successful bacterial cultivation to both Morrison's military allies and Marcus's scientific community, sparking a coordinated effort to mass-produce and distribute the cure across the remaining survivor populations. The infected, meanwhile, had begun to show signs of evolutionary adaptation to the loss of their electromagnetic coordination, with some groups developing new forms of communication and organization that didn't rely on external signals. Reports from scout teams indicated that the creatures were learning to work together through pheromone trails and primitive vocalizations, suggesting that humanity's window for deploying the cure was rapidly closing as the infected continued to evolve. Dr. Warren's first successful batch of bacterial cure was tested on volunteers who had been recently infected, and the results exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Not only did the treatment prevent the progression of infection, but it actually restored cognitive function to individuals who had begun showing early symptoms of transformation. The cure worked by essentially reprogramming the infected cells to reject the viral invasion, turning the victim's own immune system into a weapon against the outbreak. As news of the cure's success spread through the survivor networks, communities across the continent began mobilizing resources for a coordinated counterattack against the infected hordes. The three convoy groups had become the nucleus of a new alliance between survivor communities, sharing technology, personnel, and hope in quantities that had seemed impossible during the dark days following Haven Ridge's fall. The final battle for humanity's future would not be fought with conventional weapons alone, but with science, cooperation, and the determination of survivors who had learned that their greatest strength lay not in their ability to hide from the infected, but in their capacity to work together toward a common goal of reclaiming their world from the forces that had nearly destroyed it.